Well, thanks so much for having me. It's an adventure in these COVID times to be doing something like this at this hour of the day, spicing things up over here in California. I wondered, Sophia, if I could go ahead and get the slides. I'm going to just jump right in. But I wanted to thank Sarah for reminding me where I've come from, and that some of my initial concerns around extractivism have always been about how extraction produces, you know, in the bioprospecting work, oddly enough, produces publics and produces a public precisely as a site of extraction, of exploitability in an interesting and probably counterintuitive way. I am fighting a cold, so someone could let me know in the chat if my voice dips below audible level. That would be helpful. So I'm going to share with you basically some provocations today. This is some work drawn from some thinking and writing I'm doing on questions of crowd and crowd theory, and really working with the idea that crowd theory is good to think with today on a range of fronts. Now, let me just start here. Can I have the first slide, please? Let's see, get my screen organized. Thank you. I'm just going to start with a simple premise that I don't think requires a whole lot of explanation or justification. Forgive me if it does, but I'm just going to assume that we're all on this particular same page, which is that social media are, or is, extractive. We can think of that in so many ways, from the creation and exploitation of racialized, globally segmented labor pools around, say, content moderation, certainly questions of data mining, scrolling, and clicking as food for targeted advertising, etc. Right? The entire process of being online, certainly, and being involved in social media feeds the wholesale conversion of something that looks and feels like social relations themselves, turns that into something that can be mapped, nudged, monetized, reformulated. Now, as such, next slide, please. Data and social media seem to be the perfect locus for exploring the Exalt Conference's premise, right? That extraction requires and reshapes particular social relations, right? It almost seems like the most extreme example of subsumption of social relations under capital that we could possibly imagine. Next slide, please. Now, that was certainly the premise, that argument is the premise of artist and curator Laurel Tack's very wonderful intervention from 2013 to 2014, speaking, Sarah, of feminist theory. This is a piece that showed in galleries in 2013, 2014. It's a video installation. And Sophia, if it's at all possible for you to toggle over to the website of Wages for Facebook, we can just look at it for a couple seconds and then I'll talk about it. It's not actually possible to stop it from scrolling. So I'll just give you a second, everyone who's watching, to just look at some of the pros here, and then we'll go back. Okay, I think we can pause there, Sophia, and go back to PowerPoint if you don't mind. Thank you. This is very labor intensive for you. I didn't realize. Sarah, you will recognize, I'm guessing, some of that prose. Wages for Facebook is, if you could go to the next slide, please. Actually, 2 slides down. Yeah, one more. Thank you. A fairly ingenious redux of Silvia Federici's 1975 Marxist feminist manifesto wages against housework. And basically Laurel Tack said, I realize if you swap out the word Facebook, if you swap out the word housework for Facebook, 80% of this text is still totally crystal clear, and it really freaked me out. Now, Federici's manifesto argued that unwaged social reproduction, gathered under the notion of housework, is indispensable to the workings of capital. Now, she and others pointed directly to the ideological scaffolding upholding this arrangement, the affective relations that felt like love, marriage, sex, femininity itself. Now, if we look at this slide, obviously, or at the text, you know, she's obviously done a complete word replace exercise here, given us an absolutely perfect reading of what social media looks like when seen through the lens of what the Italian autonomists call the social factory, right? And the last, one more slide, please. The last line of this manifesto is the following: we want to call work what is work, so that eventually we might discover what friendship is. Now, in the original manifesto, it says we want to call work what is work, so that eventually we might discover what love is. Okay, so here we have a perfect statement of social media as a kind of engine for the subsumption of human relations, including friendship, under the relations of capital. But let's ask a question real quick. I think this is a framework that we could all sort of absorb quite readily. But let me just pause and step sideways for a second and ask, you know, what of this friendship? What is this friendship we might rediscover that is uncontaminated by capital? Next slide, please. Now, Laura Kurgan and her colleagues have an absolutely brilliant intervention in the journal Efflux Architecture, an online journal, have traced the history of an essential premise underlying social media algorithms, which are optimized, as we know, to make, find, and connect friends, at least in Facebook's idiom, right? And that essential premise is the notion of homophily, the idea that similarity breeds connection. Now, they show that this was kind of a folksy axiom that was formalized as an experimental social science question about race and about friendship and about shared or different values in the context of racially segregated housing in the 1940s US. Now, it is a very long and complicated story, and I run some risk just dropping it in here because it's not the focus of what I want to talk about, but I find it incredibly important, and I'll tell you why I find it important. Ultimately, they are showing how this friendship, that like button, those networks of connection have baked directly into them what I think of as a rather crowded story forged in and through the matters of race and racism in the mid-century US. Now, can we go to the next slide, please? Now, you won't be able to read this or make any sense of it, but I'm posting it here as a little bit of wallpaper for us, and I can explain this in question and answer if you want. We can look at the website together too. But I just want to say that the history they give us delivers to us friendship as an instrumentalized relation of similarity, extracted from a strange and racialized concern with liberalism and illiberalism, with liberal attitudes, illiberal attitudes, tolerance or not for difference in certain ways. And all of this, I want to suggest, and again, I'm just suggesting it, I'm not explaining it fully, but all of it sets the terms for what I want to talk with you about today. Okay, next slide, please. So my primary question for this session today is not whether or even how social media is extractive. Again, I take that as axiomatic, but rather about how and in what terms we might conceptualize the social relations that feed these platforms and their forms of extraction, and that are in turn fed by them. Now, we have a lot of terms we could use to talk about this. There is, of course, the whole notion of the subsumption of social relations under capital. Trustee Macmillan Cottom has a lovely article recently about internet technologies more broadly as the form that racial capitalism itself is taking today. You've got a talk coming up Thursday as part of your conference on data colonialism. Now, I'm not here to offer an alternative framework to any of these approaches because all of them strike me as spot on, but rather to resurface an idiom that I find uncannily present in the formations on which social media platforms build their fortunes and which they seem to be so powerfully good at eliciting as well. Next slide, please. And that idiom, of course, is the crowd. Now, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, WhatsApp, Instagram, they crowd us right on up, right? Now you might say, well, of course, social media crowd us. You know, you need only think of the very instrumental sense of crowdsourcing, a very literal invocation of the crowd as a kind of, you know, pool of distributed precarious labor as a locus of extraction. So certainly social media, internet platforms crowd us in that way. Next slide, please. Social media also crowd us in this way that we came to see. You all are probably too young to even remember this, I'm sorry to say, but the early heady days of crowd emergence with the Occupy movement, with the Arab Spring, the events in Tahrir Square in Egypt, celebrated by some, not all, as Twitter revolutions, as Facebook revolutions, right? This was a moment when social media seemed infused with a sense of hopeful possibility from the standpoint of left, small d, democratic politics, right? It could crowd, it could help these platforms could really unleash the power of crowds against oppressive or coercive state power. Next slide, please. Now, you're already laughing because that was like, that's hardly a story we can tell anymore, right? How quickly things have turned. It is hard these days to countenance any necessary relation among crowds, the internet, democratic emergence, and or wisdom, even as instances of all of the above persist. Excuse me for just a second. Now, the role of Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, other platforms in various resurgent illiberalisms, the spread of misinformation, their utility for authoritarianism, even as they are also the fuel for resistance, have all made it very difficult to hold on to any fantasy, which was always under critique, that social media companies built up as massive private data generating and data extracting engines would necessarily serve as the lubricants of liberal, much less radical democratic crowd emergence. You probably are aware of these kinds of things, right? Social science researchers and investigative journalists are now asking, you know, how it is that Facebook and WhatsApp are so very good at fomenting and spreading white supremacist violence, racism, conspiracy theories, genocide. Now, this trajectory is reflected pretty clearly, I think, almost metonymically in Facebook's own transformation from a self-branded engine of connection to an accused vector of contagion. And, you know, such a concern is like completely oversaturated in these pandemic times when the World Health Organization, next slide please, has issued a worried call that the world is facing not just a pandemic, but an infodemic. You know all of this already. I don't have to kind of rant about this any longer. Now, next slide, please. This very rapid and dramatic arc from the promise of tech-enabled connection to the scourge of contagion demands, I want to suggest, an attention to crowds, but more precisely to crowd theory we cannot know crowds without crowd theory, as a heterodox and ambivalent archive of theory and method. I want to think with crowd theory not as an alternative frame to Marxist feminism or racial capitalism or data colonialism, but rather as a thing of a slightly different order, a mood, an energetic and affective terrain of contest and discourse, a history of media and mediums, an analytic palette, an idiom that is utterly saturated with the questions of racism, colonialism, authoritarianism, to name some of its many entailments. I will not be able to do all of that today, but I will at least offer some provocations. I'm going to suggest that if crowd theory is useful for thinking about social media as extraction, it's not just because social media needs a crowd. It is also because social media's extractions, it's in their form as clicks and shares and micro-targeting and retweets and virality, have, like the crowd of crowd theory, been a source and site of anxious concern about emotional contagion, about the stability and solidity of democratic social orders and the dissolution of society itself, about what binds the social together, and about pressing questions about media and mediums, and how often destructive energetic forces can travel with what seems to be such lightning speed. The terms and debates that have long accompanied, and I would say haunted, crowd theory are at the very center of, they are coterminous with, many of our current debates over social media's pernicious and even illiberal effects. So perhaps by the end of this, I'm going to suggest that what connects has always been contagion. Next slide, please. All right, crowd theory. What is crowd theory? It is a huge body of work, obviously, and I am just drawing here from some longer writings that I have done and that many, many other people have done recently about a body of theory that starts with, but certainly does not end with, people like late 19th century French social theorist and psychologist Gustave Le Bon, with Gabriel Tarde, recently subject to such a massive kind of rediscovery, especially, but not only in science studies worlds, Durkheim, Sigmund Freud, the mid-century work of Elias Canetti, many, many others. Now, I am not the only person to rediscover crowd theory recently. Christian Borch in Copenhagen has written an extraordinarily copious and interesting kind of assessment of crowd theory's place in the histories of sociology. William Mazzarella, Jody Dean, lots of work on new media and crowds, extraordinary work in anthropology on crowds and populism in Latin America, South Asia. Just about every journalist writing about rising authoritarianism on multiple continents right now. Like, the crowd is back in with a vengeance right now for reasons that are both obvious and maybe not so obvious. Next slide, please. So I'm suggesting that crowd theory is a heterodox archive of theory and method. And I want to just start by saying that in my readings of crowd theory, I see much of the work, especially with Gustave Le Bon, who's an easy target, but an instructive one nonetheless. I see crowd theory as something that has long been anxious theory, either exhibiting a certain anxiety itself, as in Le Bon, or occasioning anxiety by others. And I'll talk about that in a moment. Crowd theory has a mood, many moods. It has a universe furnished oddly, an underdetermined politics. It is certainly not one thing, but there are three occupations, or preoccupations animating much of this work that I would just highlight for us to play around with here today, to think with. And those three things are these terms here: contagion, heterogeneity, medium. Now, contagion. Slide, please. Thanks, Sophia, you're working very hard here. You know, most notably in the work of Le Bon, but also for Gabriel Tarde, differently inflected, one of the most important things about crowds and crowd theory is that when we find ourselves in crowds, we lose ourselves. At least this is Le Bon's take. You know, we lose our rationality, our individuality, our capacity for discernment. We are instead vulnerable to others. We become vulnerable to others through processes of suggestion, imitation, emotional contagion. The insights of experimental research on hypnotism and somnambulism were a crucial resource for Le Bon and fellow travelers who were asking how otherwise rational individuals might suddenly, once magnetized by the sort of mental unity of a crowd, lose their own capacity for discernment and become capable of things they would otherwise not become capable of, often extreme or irrational actions, demands, behaviors. And with this zone of concern, Le Bon was firmly in the zone of anthropology's sort of notion of primitive participation. Now, it was Le Bon's commitment to imitation suggestion as the thing that binds a crowd together, as the transformative force that takes an otherwise rational individual and turns him into something else. It's this commitment to imitation suggestion and to emotional contagion that led Christian Borch to call Le Bon's theory of the crowd anti-liberal. And by anti-liberal, he didn't necessarily mean politically, though one could make that argument, but he meant, I would say, epistemologically, right? And it was anti-liberal given the degree to which Le Bon's notions of imitation suggestion rent asunder the stable, sovereign individual as the building block of the social. In a weirdly pre-Deleuzian turn, Le Bon said, an individual in a crowd differs fundamentally from himself, right? Now, there's another way, indeed, that this is an anti-liberal notion. For Le Bon, this de-individuation was not, of course, a neutral proposition. It was suffused with a pretty pungent evolutionary racism. A famous quote you've probably all heard, and I probably shouldn't keep repeating it, but by the mere fact that he forms part of an organized crowd, Le Bon wrote, a man descends several rungs on the ladder of civilization. Isolated, he may be a cultivated individual. In a crowd, he is a barbarian, that is, a creature acting by instinct. Now, perhaps it's no wonder that much 20th century social science held this kind of crowd theory at arm's length. No less so for the fact that there has always been an uncomfortably close relation between these anti-liberal crowd theories and authoritarian tendencies. Le Bon's work was, of course, read and mobilized by Mussolini. He is now being cited by far-right pundits in the US as explaining how left-leaning mobs are trying to destroy the United States. Okay, so small wonder that in much mid to late 20th century social science, crowd theory was held at arm's length. But the anti-liberal version of crowd theory, and I mean here epistemologically as much as anything else, it's no longer banished, right? The crowd has returned, as I mentioned a minute ago, with a vengeance as a matter of concern for reasons that may seem all too pressing in today's political climate. If its anti-liberalism was the problem, its anti-liberalism now beckons. Next slide, please. Now, back to the kind of epistemological notion of an anti-liberal social theory, we could say that crowd theory, especially for Le Bon, for Gabriel Tarde, for Elias Canetti in a different idiom altogether, crowd theory is a very interesting theory of the social that far exceeds the realm of social relations as understood in a kind of human-centric Durkheimian way, right? Now, a crowd for Le Bon was something different too, and far more than a summing up or an average struck between its elements. Le Bon repeatedly insisted that the crowd is something heterogeneous. It is new, it is strange, it is different. It points to a second preoccupation here, right? The feeling that crowds are constitutively not simply human. There is in much of this work something peculiar, arguably more than, about their nature. For Tard, of course, humans are not the only monads in the world, or even in the universe. They are not the only beings through which the forces of imitation bring about resemblance. Gestures imitate gestures, ideas imitate ideas. Le Bon insisted repeatedly that crowds are something distinctive and new, a recombination, and hence a transformation of the very elements that form it. Elias Canetti, writing in a very different idiom a half-century later, evoked crowds at times as something almost alien and hungry. Open crowds, he wrote, want to feed on anything shaped like a human being. Next slide, please. I'm also interested in the way that crowds, I mean, as we think about this, for me, the like isomorphism, the complete entanglement of anxieties about crowds and crowd theory and the way we talk about social media. The way the crowd theorists understood crowds to be not just subject to mass media, for example, but to be mediums themselves, right? That they are mediums through which transit palpability and urgency, all of the things that concerned Le Bon. You know, they're not just things that are felt by crowds. Crowds are the things through the media through which these things transit. Now, if crowds are mediums, it is also the case that the rise of mass communication in the late 19th and early 20th century was part of the ether within which those arguments emerged. And I'm not just talking about, you know, Adorno and Horkheimer and this notion of the masses that are kind of overwhelmed by mass media. Thinking about someone like Edward Ross, writing in 1908, who drew directly on Tard to argue that mass media, in which case, in his case, he was referring to the telegraph, produced unprecedented conditions for contagion without contact. That is, the ability for suggestion, panic, irrationality to travel, even or especially through a crowd at a distance. Now, again, this is a concern not just that media do something to people, but that crowds are the medium through which these things travel. Okay, next slide, please. So, these are a few very quick notes on some of the notes I would extract myself from crowd theory to then ask some questions about social media. And maybe one way to phrase that question is this: what if social media is a misnomer? You know, why haven't we been calling these platforms crowd media all along? So let me frame the question in this way: how do social media crowd? I am guessing that you will have already been making such a list in your head, in your heads. Here are a few thoughts that I would offer up. Next slide, please. All right, I'm getting cheeky and just going ahead and calling social media crowd media, but it's getting a little cumbersome in terms of vocabulary, but nonetheless, let's say social media's crowds are made by suggestion, not just scale. Now, here's my suggestion here. Perhaps we can think about social media crowding us right up, not simply because of how large or powerful the aggregations are that produce data about us, right? But because of the forces and dynamics that transit through them. In other words, the crowds of crowd theory from Le Bon to, I think, micro-targeting today are often defined less by their sheer numbers than by what connects them. As with micro-targeting in advertising or electoral campaigning or hate spewing, crowding is a process of suggestionizing, Le Bon's terms, magnetizing, gathering elements into similarity spaces, to invoke a phrase of Nick Seever's, right? Similarity spaces. Now, this point matters to what it might mean to say that social media crowds us. And that is because one of the ongoing criticisms of social media has been that it makes our worlds so small, inducing, we fear or accuse, a kind of narcissism, right? From selfies to self-tracking, shrinking our news and information horizons into self-reinforcing bubbles, otherwise radically disconnecting us. But I would suggest that crowd theory draws our attention to the heterogeneous scales of crowding that are at work in precisely these forms of atomization. So if we take Gabriel Tarde and Freud seriously, atoms, individuals, cells, or selves for Freud, are already crowds. Monads in Tarde's terms that only become more complex the smaller you go. Thus, what crowds us, even in these moments of presumed atomization, is our embeddedness in algorithmic universes of suggestion and likeness, which are in turn always already racialized if we follow Kurgan and colleagues' genealogy about homophily. Now, this crowded atomization is certainly a question of scale. Big data produces these relations, but it is never only a question of bigness. So perhaps we can say that a micro-targeting electoral campaign, even if it only targets 4 people in a 3 square kilometer radius, crowds because of the forms of similarity and even susceptibility through which data points, people, ideas are both generated and brought into contact with each other. Next slide, please. Now, crowd theory gives us a theory of the social that is already not made of people only, right? And this is a ridiculous illustration that looks incredibly outdated from New York Times, from an article called "Social Media Bots Offer Phony Friends and Real Profit." It feels like it's from the era of the Flintstones or something. But let me just take seriously Canetti here, right? We know that Facebook, Twitter, and other platforms have become highly effective suggestionizing machines, in part because of their ability to generate data, to extract data through actions and behavior of that which looks like a human, right? Bots, markets and Twitter followers, click farms, fake accounts, machine learning now, these are all central to how Facebook and Twitter elicit data crowds and also crowd us. Next slide, please. Now, I mentioned earlier an arc, as if a fall from grace, from the early kind of hopes around social media as a vector of connection to the crushing reality that they are vectors of contagion. But what if what connects has always been contagion? That is what crowd theory has primed us to ask. Now, I'm harping on Facebook here. It's an easy mark. Again, there's been a lot written about it. I don't know anyone who actually uses it, and I'd be curious to know in the comments and in your questions later if you use it. It is nonetheless an incredibly powerful source of information, and it plays a massive role in US electoral politics. It seemed to play a big role in the Brexit referendum. It is out there. So I'm just taking as read that it matters, even though I think the question of who uses it is a very interesting, strange one. Okay, nonetheless, there has been a lot written about how Facebook connects precisely by instrumentalizing and monetizing emotional contagion itself. I'm not taking poetic liberties when I say that. You know, until users and scholars objected too loudly, academic psychologists collaborating with Facebook have routinely used the social network as a ready-made experimental platform for studying more or less the thing that concerned Edward Ross about the telegraph in 1908, contagion without contact. Now, there's a lot to say about this study, but let me just give you some of the language they used to talk about what they did. With a spectacularly matter-of-fact tone of those accustomed to asking these kinds of questions, the study authors described their research results as follows. We show, via a massive N of 689,000 people, experiment on Facebook, that emotional states can be transferred to others via emotional contagion, leading people to experience the same emotions without their awareness, etc. Now, emotional contagion is not an ancillary effect of social media. As scholars of the attention economy have shown, it is at the heart of Facebook's business model. The company sells attention and hence sells advertising by multiplying clicks and shares, which in turn accumulate and spread more effectively the more intense the emotional affect involved. Pardon me. I'm thinking here of Tim Wu's book and Shiva Vaidyanathan's and many other people's work. Now, Facebook is obviously not unique in using this principle. It is the business model of multi-platform, data-driven news and entertainment media more broadly. Now, I would just say the obvious here, which is the transit of affect and irrationality, of fake news and extreme sentiment through these networks is precisely the problem that Le Bon named when he worried about the destructive power of emotional contagion. Of course, Le Bon was concerned that crowds would undo democratic society because, that crowds mobilizing for democratic equality were going to undo the kind of aristocratic society in which he was invested. We are hearing today, of course, of the opposite, the worry that the crowdings of social media are undoing democracy itself. Now, on that point, next slide, please. Right, in a 2018 report written for the Data and Society Institute on the challenges for journalists posed by the nexus of extremism, violence, misinformation, and social media, Whitney Phillips wrote, in the social media age, the commoditization of content in the form of traffic, clicks, and likes has tethered editorial strategy to analytics like never before. The emphasis on quantifiable metrics stacks the news cycle with stories most likely to generate the highest level of engagement possible across as many platforms as possible. Things traveling too far, too fast, with too much emotional urgency is exactly the point. Now, needless to say, things traveling too fast, too far, and with too much emotional urgency is the scenario that crowd theorists contended with, that early 20th century social scientists experimentalized, and that monetized data materializes and enables. Now, and this point is, of course, what drives many of us who are not former Facebook engineers to lament that social media are destroying the fabric of society itself, the rationality and facts on which a certain notion of democratic civility, presumably, are based. And I'm pointing to a litany of complaints right now, especially, but not only in the US. Okay. I'm gonna just wrap up with a couple of last questions here. I asked at the outset of these comments how And in what terms might we conceptualize the social relations that are the substrate and the effects of social media as a kind of platform capitalism? Now, I have been trying to convey, and I did it in a fairly schematic or speculative way here for you this evening, trying to get through a bunch of different points. I've been trying to think about what to do with the striking resonances of the ways in which crowd theory's distinctive preoccupations, right, the potentially destructive but also generative force of emotional contagion, the peculiarly more than human heterogeneity of crowds, a concern with ineffable energetic forces travel, a constitutive racism, have come so alive in recent discussions of what platform capitalism and social media have wrought, or rather what we have wrought through them. Now, all of this raises the question of what relations we think other relations with, not to get too Strathern-y here, invocation of Marilyn Strathern, but I have been trying to think through the resonance in such a way that I am not using crowd theory to explain social media, or to say that, aha, there was something repressed that has now returned. The crowd was gone and now it's back. The crowd has always been with us. The question is, it has returned as a matter of concern in some incredibly vivid and interesting ways, and that our conversations around and anxieties about media are an absolutely central locus for revisiting exactly those concerns. Now, perhaps my point here, in just drawing out some suggestive resonances, is to get us to think about extractivism, or to ask, after the question of extractivism, what can and can it, what does it exhaust? We think about extractivism as in many ways exhausting resources, exhausting social relations, evacuating them of their true content, of their pre-subsumption nature, of the friendship that existed before and outside of Facebook. But I want to suggest that perhaps if we think about the ways that social media extracts data through this intense kind of affective resonance, affective projects, through our own love and pleasure, all of these things that feminist theorists brought up in the 70s, that perhaps extractivism is a language itself that might not exhaust our languages, our understandings of the kinds of power involved in these technologies. So I leave you with that, with the question of exhaustion, not because I'm exhausted, actually, I'm surprisingly awake, but because I want to ask, I'm very curious what you all make of this. I'm curious what use you make of social media right now. I'm curious what the theory, what the notion that it is extractivist does to and with your own engagements in the world. And so with that, I leave it to you to hopefully open up a conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Cori. That was absolutely fascinating. And I'm definitely going to read those upcoming texts that you've got coming. And while people are beginning to come to their thoughts and questions and so on, I'll just make a couple of comments and a question. People can ask on the chat, or they can raise their hands to ask in person, just so while people are thinking. as you were talking, there were two images that came into my mind in terms of work that I've been doing recently, and one was the idea of contagion. And actually I have been working for complicated reasons on issues to do with plague and cholera in the Mediterranean during the Ottoman period. And that looked at, there have been a lot of different theories about why it was that the Ottomans were labeled as the sick man of Europe, that they were the ones who spread plague and cholera and yellow fever and whatever else around the Mediterranean. And it replacing the Orientalist idea that they were, you know, sort of fatalistic and so on, was the idea that actually it was to do with the way they had organized their empire, that they were trading, they were a trading nation, and so that, you know, it became a hub. The point is here is the degree to which the theory that you're pointing to is actually the thing that's driving the phenomenon. So that's one issue. And the other is what you kind of ended with, which was about the relation, what happens to the relation in crowds, what kinds of social relations are these? And there's been people who've suggested that Facebook and other social media actually disaggregate persons so decrowd them in a way to the point at which they atomize them, so that they turn them into people who buy hair dryers. That part of each person who buys a hairdryer is then combined with every other part of a person who buys a hairdryer, and then gets packaged and sold to a hairdryer manufacturer. And so that actually the crowd becomes something even less than single human beings, but little bits of human beings.
Yeah.
So that's one kind of question of what you think about that idea. And then the other is Haraway and cyborgs, and the fact that quite a lot of what is apparently turning this crowd into crowd is an algorithm, and how that fits into what you're looking at and suggesting here. So I'll start with that. I have a bunch of other questions, but I'll just start with that.
Thank you, Sarah. Those are lovely comments. And yeah, I mean, let me start with the not easy one, the disaggregation aggregation dynamic. I mean, I think that is precisely the one of the starting points for me, was thinking about how we talk about the units of these crowds, and and so what I find so interesting, going back and rereading Tard, my American version of the French, Tard, Le Bon Canetti and others, is that there's already a language in there in this work from the late 19th about disaggregation and reaggregation and recombination, not anticipating algorithms necessarily, or algorithmic filtering, but that crowds, I think, from that moment forward have been configured in this way, in a way for which there is a very interesting and rich language for these kinds of heterogeneous elements and transformations and reconfigurations. But that is also why I brought up this thing about how crowds, even in these moments of presumed atomization, that the process through which we are being rearranged, right, and reaggregated, as you say, as people who buy hairdryers, is itself formed through you know, a kind of algorithmic filtering that is based on similarity and creating similarity spaces. It's based on the instrumentalization of an entire idea about likeness that carries with it these sort of interestingly illiberal presuppositions that have run right through the story of crowd theory. And so it's not that I'm trying to argue there's nothing new about them, or like, oh, crowd theory already explains everything, but that actually immanent within crowd theory and some of the preoccupations of that body of literature are some very interesting languages through which we might apprehend, for example, the question of scale or aggregation and disaggregation, that even as we're being atomized, we're being crowded, right? And so I always ask my students, you know, when you're online and you're like doing this one thing and, you know, taking a selfie and posting it or whatever, like, are you alone, you know, or are you in a crowd? And they know they're supposed to say they're in a crowd, but they don't feel it. You know, they feel alone. You feel, and so the questions of privacy, that's about privacy and a certain sense of subjectivity. But nonetheless, like the question of how we are crowded, even as we are atomized, I think is important. Then the question of like, what kind of political agency does that crowding have? That's where things get interesting, because, you know, the argument around atomization is almost always one that's about how markets atomize us and make us impotent as political actors, right? And so then that becomes an interesting question, as to ask what kind of political potency might there be in these otherwise conceptual, in these aggregations that are conceptualized otherwise through crowd theory. Yes, I love Haraway and Cyborg. And yeah, I mean, it's a question of to what degree do we see our affinities? You know, that's really an impassioned plea for the notion of affinity rather than identity as a basis for political action. So again, you know, to transform or to think about how these crowdy formations in all of their contamination, right? She was very much arguing for the possibility of solidarity and political affinity, even if that means standing from a position of impurity. It always does, right? That how we kind of mobilize that kind of political imagination right now, I think, is more important than ever before. And I think it's very apt for this stuff. So thank you for bringing that up. Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, on that note, that was the other part of what I wanted to ask about the relation. You mentioned Strathern briefly, and for those in the audience who aren't anthropologists, excuse me for a moment. Strathern makes that distinction between an ethnicist version of relation and kinship version of relation, in which the ethnicist is about similarity. You know, those things, what you referred to as homophily. So those entities that look the same, feel the same, they gather together because of that. Whereas with the kind of kinship idea of relation, it's actually a set of rules about how different kinds of people are connected together by a set of principles. So that, you know, brothers-in-law famously are related to one another because of their different relation to one woman. One has a sister, the other has a wife. So the crowd theory seems to have as an underlying premise the idea of the the blending, the similarity, except there's something added onto it, as you were pointing out in your discussions of Le Bon. And so one of the things there is, how do people how would you, is the theory really going to assume that it has to be a homophilous relation, and therefore one that is actually exclusionary of difference, rather than another idea of relation which would be inclusionary, axiomatically inclusionary of difference?
Right. The question is what we would want, and what folks who are tracking the history of homophily argue.
Or what's happening on social media.
I don't know about like going back into this slide, but it's so interesting. That article on homophily as sort of the urban history of an algorithm is so interesting this way. I don't want to go on and on about this if others have a question, but I'll just say that one of the ways that these guys tracked the history of the algorithm and its origins in a kind of liberal social science, anti-racist work, so fascinating, where they went into these housing estates around Chicago, I believe, and were trying to ask questions that could illuminate whether people thought integration, i.e. racially mixed housing, was better than segregation, racially separated housing, right? Yeah. And they go through this entire incredibly close read of all the things that happened in the name of that social science research. And it got very complicated, but basically the researchers were basically asking white residents and Black residents all kinds of things, including, do you enjoy hanging out with people of another race, right? Heterophily, right? Do you enjoy difference? And they classified those answers, and there was like an even mix among white people of people who said, yes, I like that, and people were like, I'm not sure, and people were like, no, thank you very much, right? And most of the Black respondents said, yes, that's good. A few were ambivalent, one of 80 or something said, no, I don't want that. Because there weren't enough Black respondents who said no to segregation, basically, or to integration, they discarded all of the Black residents' answers, and they built a theory of homophily that like likes like, based only on the white respondents' answers. Okay, and then the authors are showing how, the authors of this incredible reconstruction are showing us how, on the basis of conclusions derived from that move, only taking white people's responses, that then they develop a theory around your three closest friends, which became formalized as a principle of triadic closure, which became a principle that was then scaled up into network science and directly into social media's algorithms. Like, it's an extraordinary kind of thing. So this is why they're saying the principle of homophily encoded within it a very, very narrow closed network notion of what similarity even is and what it can recognize, and that it values and produces networks that that travel along very narrowly conceived understandings of similarity, right? And they're making an argument that one could change this so that there is greater tolerance for difference, right? And making a kind of liberal argument around that. Anyway, that was a long-winded response, but I think that gets at the heart of this question of like, where is difference in this story? Where is heterophily? And where can it be injected back into the story? Sorry, I'll let others ask questions.
Yes, no, thank you. Okay, opening the floor now. We've only got a few minutes left. Has anybody got a question?
I'm quite curious. If no one has a question, I have questions for you all.
Okay.
Really quick, Cori.
Yeah,
Hi,
please.
it's Sophia breaking in.
Yeah.
We do have one question that's come in via the chat. And then also, I know you asked at the beginning, you were interested in how we used Facebook. And I've created a little poll. Would you like me to launch that?
Yes.
All right, launching a poll. So please, that should pop up on your screen, and please give a vote.
That's great. And I was also going to ask if people felt like this was a very US focused story, or rather if any of what I said even resonates with what you all experience. Okay, there's a question in the chat.
All right.
Yeah.
Most of you have voted. 10 more seconds if you haven't voted yet. All right. So can everybody see the results?
Huh.
Okay.
Wow. Fascinating. Okay, I stand corrected. That's really, so this squares very well with, sorry, I'm not going to pronounce your name very well. Valeria, is that how the proper pronunciation in the chat? What is exhausted through social media? Those who don't use social media are exhausted, having to try and reconnect with people in other ways. Yeah, I find your observation really interesting. And yes, there is a big divide that's growing between people who kind of know how to talk to each other and connect in that through those media and those who are not on it. I'm seeing more and more undergraduate students who are not on social media and are kind of rediscovering what it means to talk to each other. And I'm seeing another question about empirical research. Let me just read that. Yeah. Laura, what field are you in, may I ask?
In sociology and media studies, but I've been studying a bit of disinformation, and I was interested in these crowd theories and suggestibility and these sort of processes, but then I felt like it didn't help me that much in understanding, because I was studying actually Facebook comments to these right-wing junk news, and then I ended up using Margaret Wetherell's affective meaning-making concept, which doesn't separate between affect and discourse.
Yeah.
But I mean, I still feel that these are theoretically really interesting, but then sometimes for empirical research, it's difficult to see how they map into that like real world data.
Oh, totally. I know. Are you familiar with that Facebook, the infamous Facebook study from 2014?
Yeah, I am. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because the debates around them, I'm going in my own slides. I realize you can't see my slides. But I'm just going back to that screen that has the Facebook study on it. If you followed that and you saw that there's so many debates about the methods, right? That what the researchers ended up calling evidence of emotional contagion was that they planted a few emotionally charged words, I think affectively charged in a positive sense, mostly, if I'm not mistaken, words that the researchers determined were positively charged, and then argued that they detected that there was a kind of uptick in positive charge of people in their sort of friend networks, right? But one of the arguments, I mean, there are many arguments about this study and criticisms of it. And one was that they were only able to show this kind of contagion effect because of the massive scale, right? There was like a tiny, tiny effect that ramifies at scale because there was almost 700,000 people in the study, right? So the question of like what counts as a detectable effect is one. The other is, yes, of course, these researchers are using very, what feel like arbitrary proxies for something as complex as these subjective processes that you're talking about. So that, I think your questions get exactly at the issues that folks are raising here, that emotional contagion is both like, it feels like a very palpable, tangible, dangerous force when I think about what is the kinds of violences that are being incited on social media right now on Facebook in this country are kind of extraordinary, right? And you can see how ideas spread, and it feels very palpable and tangible and dangerous and must be shut down, right? Or something like that, like it is worthy of attention. You have this sort of tangibility or this sense like something's happening. And then alongside that, and as part of it, but not totally coterminous with it, is the total kind of instrumentalization, because the monetization of this thing that gets called emotional contagion as a source of revenue for advertising, right? Or a source of revenue for Facebook through advertising dollars, right? So like, are these the same kinds of emotional contagion would be an implication of your question. And I'm not sure. Like, emotional contagion itself is an object here that's being batted around and instrumentalized and used in some interesting ways, rather than a phenomenon that we can just go in and detect, I guess is what I would say.
Yeah, it's a good point that it's a big incentive also of the these social media companies, for them, if such a thing exists as emotional contagion, that's what they want in a way, and they want to also generate it and learn about it.
Yeah. So how are you doing? What kind of research are you doing?
Well, I'm mostly interested in studying social media and datafication and algorithms, but also with a focus on user agency and creative user behaviors. So I think that's why I feel like sometimes this crowd theory feels a bit like it's difficult to, or it feels kind of deterministic almost at times, and also like that the audience is seen as a homogeneous group, which of course, when you think about like more active audiences type of media research, doesn't really fit in so well with that perspective. I don't know if I'm making much sense now, but
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this material is letting me just like, get all of my dystopian pessimism and misery about the current political situation out on the page. And it is quite dark, actually. So I will just cop to that, to what you just said. And if there's another.
Yeah, well, something, because actually, the Finland is almost equally interested in what's going on in the US election right now. Interestingly, there's a question there, and also Sophia, we only have 2 minutes left. Sophia had another poll. Maybe we could have that quick poll while you're answering Stamler's question. Facebook opposed people.
I'm wondering about the. Oh, thank you. I love it. Instant sociology. The increasing crowd of Facebook opposed people who explicitly want to stay out of this neoliberal project. Yeah. How does contagion work among these people, or is there research about this side? I mean, right. First of all, I think this goes up to Valeria's point too, that not everyone is on social media. Like, you can't I am not saying that everyone is on this, right? And that therefore it is sort of universalizing. I do think what I'm trying to say is not that there's a process of contagion that works on all of us and, wherever we are, but rather to point to the degree to which social media seems to be in many ways weaponizing, monetizing, instrumentalizing many of the things that crowd theorists, argued were at work in the world. And so in a way, I'm not trying to give us a psychological explanation either, that crowd theory that social media must necessarily do this because people are like this, right? Because we because we are all secret authoritarians or something like that, but rather that that these are political decisions, actually. Like, this is the other point, right? The fact that Facebook is doing what Facebook is doing, and the way that it's doing it, and the way that it is free of, certain kinds of regulation and all of that. These are all political processes and political decisions and political effects, and they could be otherwise. So for me, really, it's just a way to sort of think about some of the mechanisms through which social media are actually activating not just crowds, but anxieties about crowds. But I think the question of refusal, there was just a big conference here on tech refusal, super interesting. And I think you get to that online as well through the algorithmic fairness working group. But yeah, no, the question of refusal and staying off of it is absolutely super important and interesting. So thank you for bringing that up.
And I'm afraid we're completely out of time now, but this was fantastic. Thank you. Absolutely wonderful way and really thought-provoking way to begin this whole conference. And thank you once again for staying up. I mean, it must now be about 1:30 or 2:30 in the morning for you.
I'm good. Thanks to you, Sarah, for inviting me, and Sophia for the instant polling, and for all of you being game to indulge me in this little thought experiment. So I really appreciate it.